November 1, 1700 Madrid. Inside the Royal Alcazar, a palace that had watched over Spain's golden age for 2 centuries, King Charles II of Spain lay dying in a chamber thick with incense and whispered prayers, and when the court physicians finally performed their autopsy 3 days later, what they found inside his body would be written down in Latin as if the language itself could contain the horror: a heart the size of a peppercorn, lungs, corroded intestines, putrefied and gangrenous. 3 large stones in a single kidney, 1 testicle, black as coal, and a head full of water. But you could see the curse long before they opened him. You could see it in portraits painted by Velázquez and Carrillo de Miranda. You could see it in the way his lower jaw jutted forward like the prow of a sinking ship, protruding so far beyond his upper teeth that he couldn't chew solid food. Couldn't speak without drooling, couldn't close his mouth even when he tried, and this wasn't a birth defect or a random mutation, this was mathematic. This was 16 generations of European royalty deciding that DNA was less important than a family tree. And by the time Charles II died at 38 years old, bald and senile and racked with epileptic seizures, his inbreeding coefficient stood at 0.254, which meant he was more inbred than the average child of a brother and sister. The physicians called him El Hechizado, the Bewitched, because in 17th century Spain, it was easier to blame witchcraft than to admit what the family had done to itself. If this deep dive into Europe's darkest dynasties fascinates you, subscribe now. There's more horror hidden in history's most powerful bloodlines. This is the story of the Habsburg jaw, a genetic deformity so distinctive that scientists in 2019 could diagnose it from 400-year-old paintings, and it's the story of how the most powerful family in Europe spent 2 centuries marrying uncle to niece, cousin to cousin, building an empire that stretched from Vienna to Madrid to the New World, only to watch that empire crumble not from revolution or war, but from the inside out, from DNA that had been Xeroxed too many times. From a bloodline that became so pure it couldn't produce a single living heir. The Habsburgs didn't start as monsters, they started as minor nobility in what is now Switzerland, a family with ambition, but limited land, and their great innovation wasn't military conquest or cultural genius, it was matrimony. It was realizing that you could acquire kingdoms faster through marriage, contracts, than through siege warfare, and so they married, and they married strategically, and by the early 1500s, they controlled Austria, Hungary, Bohemia, the Netherlands, Spain, Naples, Sicily, and vast territories in the Americas that hemorrhaged silver by the ton back to Europe. The family motto was written in Latin: Bella gerant, alii tu felix Austria nube, which translates roughly to "let others wage war, you happy Austria shall marry." And it worked spectacularly for about 200 years until the mathematics caught up with them. In 1516, Charles I became King of Spain, and when you look at his portrait today, painted by the Flemish master Bernard van Orly, you can already see it beginning. You can see the slightly elongated lower jaw, what an Italian diplomat in 1517 described as a long cadaverous face, and a lopsided mouth which drops open when he is not on his guard. But Charles I was still functional, still brilliant, even he spoke 6 languages, he ruled the largest empire the world had seen since Rome. And his inbreeding coefficient was only 0.38, barely above baseline. But Charles I set the pattern that would doom his descendants, because in 1526, he married Isabella of Portugal, and Isabella wasn't just any Portuguese princess, she was his first cousin, the daughter of his mother's sister, and their marriage produced Philip I, who inherited not 1 but 2 copies of certain recessive genes, and Philip I, learning nothing from genetics, he didn't understand, married 4 times, and 3 of those 4 wives were blood relatives. Philip I's first wife was Maria Manuela of Portugal, another first cousin, and she died giving birth to Don Carlos in 1545, and Don Carlos grew up with severe physical deformities, a hunchback, one shoulder higher than the other, and what contemporaries described as episodes of madness, violent rages where he attacked servants and courtiers, and he died at age 23 under mysterious circumstances, possibly murdered by his own father, who saw him as an embarrassment to the crown. Philip I's third wife was Elizabeth of Valois, a French princess and one of the few outsiders to marry into the Spanish line, and she gave him 2 daughters who survived to adulthood, proof that hybrid vigor works even in royal bloodlines. But when Elizabeth died in childbirth in 1568, Philip returned to the family playbook and married his niece Anna of Austria, daughter of his sister Maria, and Emperor Maximilian II, and this uncle-niece union produced Philip III, whose inbreeding coefficient jumped to 0.218, and you could see it in his face, the jaw more pronounced than his father's, the eyes slightly too far apart, the general sense that something had gone wrong at the genetic level. The problem was that Philip I married his cousin Margaret of Austria in 1599, and their son Philip IV married his niece Mariana of Austria in 1649, who was 30 years younger than him, and whose own father was Philip IV's brother, which meant that Philip IV's children were also his great-nieces and great-nephews, and if you're starting to lose track of who's related to whom, that's precisely the point. The family tree had stopped branching and started looping back on itself like by a strip made of royal blood. Diego Velázquez captured this world at its peak in 1656 when he painted Las Meninas, and if you stand in front of it today in the Prado Museum in Madrid, what you see is a room flooded with golden light. The Infanta Margaraga Teresa, at age 5 in a dress of silver and white, her maids of honor kneeling beside her with a red cup of water, and in the mirror at the back of the room, barely visible, the reflection of King Philip IV and Queen Mariana watching their daughter. Watching Velázquez paint, and what the painting doesn't tell you is that Margarita would grow up to marry her uncle Leopold I of Austria, or that her younger brother Charles would be born 5 years later with an inbreeding coefficient of 0.254, or that Philip and Maria would have 6 children together and only 2 would survive past age 10. The infant mortality rate in the Spanish Habsburg line was 50%, which was double the rate of Spanish peasants who lived in dirt floor cottages and drank contaminated water. This is what they bought with their empires. The Habsburgs knew something was wrong. They had to know, because the evidence was everywhere. It was in the stillbirths, and the children who died before they learned to walk. It was in Philip IV's first son, Don Carlos, who was born in 1545 with severe physical and mental disabilities and died at 23. It was in Philip IV himself, who fathered 12 children between 2 wives and watched 10 of them die before adulthood. But what they didn't understand was the mechanism. They didn't have the language of genetics or recessive alleles or homozygosity. All they had was the creeping suspicion that God was angry with them. Between 1527 and 1661, when Charles I was born, the Spanish Habsburg kings and queens produced 34 children, and the numbers tell a story more horrifying than any autopsy report. 5 were stillborn or miscarried, 6 died within their first month of life, 14 more died before reaching age 10, and only 9 survived to adulthood. And of those 9, several were sickly, several were mentally impaired, and several died young from what we would now recognize as genetic disorders, but what 17th century physicians attributed to bad humors or divine punishment. The family kept meticulous records. They had to, because succession was everything when you ruled half of Europe, and buried in those records are letters from Philip IV to his brother Ferdinand, letters where the king admits in coded language that he fears the family line is weakening, that his children are delicate, that perhaps they have been too careful in preserving the bloodline. But even these admissions never translated into action. Never resulted in a decision to marry outside the family, because the political cost of bringing in foreign blood was considered too high, the risk of diluting Habsburg power too great, and so they continued generation after generation, believing that royal blood was something that had to be defended rather than refreshed. A 2019 study published in the Annals of Human Biology recruited 10 maxillofacial surgeons to analyze 66 portraits of 15 Habsburg family members, measuring 18 different dysmorphic features across their faces. And what the surgeons found was a statistically significant correlation between each family member's inbreeding coefficient and the severity of mandibular prognathism, which is the medical term for a jaw that juts forward like a ledge, and maxillary deficiency, which is when the upper jaw doesn't develop properly, creating a concave midface and hollow cheeks, and together these two conditions create what became known as the Habsburg jaw. Philip IV had it. His inbreeding coefficient was 0. 88, and in Portraits by Velázquez, you can see how the artist tried to minimize it by painting Philip at three-quarter angles by keeping his mouth closed by using the elaborate ruffled collars of 17th century fashion to distract from the jawline. But by the time you get to Charles there was no angle that could hide it, no collar high enough to obscure it. Charles I was born on November 6th, 1661, and the problems were immediate. He couldn't nurse properly because his tongue was too large. He didn't walk until he was 8 years old. He was raised almost as an infant until age 10, and even as he grew older, he aged. Prematurely bald, by 35, his spine curved, his limbs weak, suffering chronic infections that suggested a broken immune system, seizures that suggested neurological damage, and through it all, that jaw protruding 2 centimeters beyond where a jaw should end, making it impossible to chew, turning every meal into an ordeal of swallowing food whole while his court pretended not to notice. British envoy Alexander Stanhope wrote in 1690 that Charles has a ravenous stomach and swallows all he eats whole, for his nether jaw stands so much out that his 2 rows of teeth cannot meet. The jaw wasn't vanity, it wasn't cosmetic, it was a signpost pointing to deeper corruption in the genetic code, and modern geneticists speculate that Charles likely suffered from at least 2 separate recessive disorders, simultaneously combined pituitary hormone deficiency, which would explain his short stature and delayed development, and distal renal tubular acidosis, which would explain the kidney stones found in his autopsy. And the reason these rare diseases appeared together in one person was because his family tree had become so tangled that recessive genes had nowhere to hide anymore. They married him twice, first to Marie-Louise of Orleans in 1679 when he was 17, and she was 16, and she wrote letters back to France describing a husband who couldn't father children, who aged like spoiled meat, who suffered from what she delicately called constitutional problems, and when she died suddenly in 1689 at age 26, there were whispers of poison, but more likely it was just despair, just the weight of being married to a king who was biologically incapable of producing an heir. Marie-Louise's letters, preserved in the French Royal Archives, paint a portrait of a marriage that was a diplomatic necessity, but a human tragedy. She wrote to her aunt, Madame de Maintenon, describing how Charles would sit silently during meals, food falling from his mouth because he couldn't close his jaw properly, how he suffered from what she called fits that we would now recognize as epileptic seizures, how the Spanish court physicians subjected her to humiliating examinations to determine why she hadn't conceived, never once questioning whether the problem might lie with the king himself, and in one particularly devastating letter from 1688, she wrote simply, "I am the most unhappy creature in the world," and less than a year later she was dead officially from appendicitis, though some historians suggest she may have taken her own life. They married him again in 1690 to Maria Anna of Neuburg, 23 years old and terrified, and for 10 more years the court waited for a pregnancy that would never come, and the silence in that marriage was deafening. It was the sound of a dynasty ending, not with war or revolution, but with simple reproductive failure. Charles spent his final years convinced he was cursed, and the Spanish court, desperate for answers, brought in exorcists and witch-finders. They performed rituals to break the supposed hex. They even dug up the corpse of a previous queen to see if it had been the victim of sorcery, and all the while Charles deteriorated, his seizures worsening, his mind slipping, until finally on November 1, 1700. The last male Habsburg of Spain died in his bedroom in the Alcazar with priests chanting around him. His death certificate listed the cause as bewitchment. The autopsy 3 days later told a different story, the story written in Latin about the peppercorn heart and the gangrenous intestines and the head full of water. But even the physicians couldn't see the whole picture. They couldn't see the runs of homozygosity spiraling through his chromosomes. They couldn't see how every cell in his body carried identical copies of defective genes inherited from ancestors who appeared multiple times in his family tree. They couldn't see that Charles's 2 parents shared more DNA than the average uncle and niece, that his inbreeding coefficient of 0.254 meant he had less genetic diversity than most people get from a single parent. They just knew he was broken, and that with him the Spanish Habsburg line was extinct. The War of the Spanish Succession began almost immediately. France and Austria and England and the Dutch Republic tearing Europe apart for 13 years over who would inherit Spain's empire, and by the time the Treaty of Utrecht was signed in 1713, Spain had lost its territories in Italy and the Netherlands had ceded Gibraltar to Britain, had been reduced from a superpower to a second-rate kingdom. And all of it traced back to a simple biological fact: the last king couldn't produce a child because his parents were too closely related. The Austrian branch of the Habsburg survived longer. They kept the throne until 1918, but they learned nothing from Spain's collapse. They kept marrying within the family. They kept believing that royal blood was something that had to be protected rather than diversified. And the genetic damage accumulated generation by generation, showing up as hemophilia in the Romanovs, as porphyria in the Hanoverians, as Habsburg jaw in portraits hanging in museums across Europe. Silent testimony to what happens when power becomes more important than survival. The Austrian Habsburgs produced their own gallery of genetic damage. Emperor Ferdinand I, who ruled from 1835 to 1848, suffered from epilepsy and hydrocephalus, and was described by contemporaries as not quite right in the head. Franz Joseph I, who ruled from 1848 to 1916, watched his son Rudolf commit suicide at Mayerling in 1889, his wife Elizabeth assassinated in Geneva in 1898, his nephew Franz Ferdinand shot in Sarajevo in 1940. And through it all, the family kept insisting on dynastic purity, kept arranging marriages between cousins, kept pretending that the accumulating evidence of genetic decline was just bad luck or political conspiracy, rather than the inevitable result of a closed breeding population. Today, if you walk through the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna or the Prado in Madrid, you can play a game, spot the jaw, watch it emerge gradually through the centuries. Mild in Charles I, moderate in Philip I, severe in Philip IV, catastrophic in Charles I. What you're seeing isn't just genetics. You're seeing the visual evidence of a belief system. You're seeing what happens when a family decides that ordinary human DNA isn't good enough for them, that they need to keep the bloodline pure, even if it means marrying uncle to niece for 200 years. The 2019 study concluded that the Habsburg jaw was caused by recessive genes that became more common with each generation of inbreeding, and that the deformity should be considered a marker of diminished genetic fitness, which is scientific language for this family was dying, and they couldn't stop it. But here's what haunts me about this story. They had all the warning signs. They had the infant mortality. They had Charles IA's entire miserable existence playing out in real time. And they never stopped. They never said maybe we should marry outside the family. They never admitted that their solution was the problem. And by the time they did stop, by the time the line went extinct, it was only because there was no one left to marry. The last portrait of Charles I painted by Juan Carreo de Miranda around 1685 shows him at age 24 looking like he's 60, bald jaw, jutting forward eyes, vacant, wearing the elaborate costume of Spanish royalty like a child playing dress up in his grandfather's clothes. And somewhere in the Prado storage vaults there's probably a medical file with the original autopsy notes, the Latin description of the peppercorn heart, and I wonder if anyone ever connected the dots. If anyone ever said out loud, "We did this to him." The genetic fortress they built to protect their power became their tomb. The purity they tried to preserve became poison, and in the end, what killed the Spanish Habsburgs wasn't plague or revolution or military defeat. It was math. It was the simple arithmetic of what happens when you Xerox the same genetic code too many times. And if there's a lesson in any of this, it's that isolation, whether genetic or political or ideological, is always fatal in the long run. That system's designed to keep everything out, eventually keep nothing in, that the walls you build to protect yourself become the walls of your own prison. The Habsburg jaw is still visible in portraits from Vienna to Madrid, still measurable in scientific studies 300 years after the last Habsburg king died, and every time geneticists calculate another inbreeding coefficient, every time maxillofacial surgeons measure another protruding jaw in a Velázquez painting, they're documenting the same truth, that power without diversity is extinction with extra steps.